Hi, and welcome to lesson 6 of the 28-day Embodied Confidence Bootcamp. This lesson is called Our Collective Conditioning. I want to introduce this model to you. It's a model that comes from generative somatics. And this model, Sites of Shaping, Sites of Change, essentially helps us understand how we have been impacted by our environment. So, in lesson 1 and lesson 2, we talked about how we are born with neurons in our brain, but little connectivity between the neurons, and that is there so that we can learn to adapt to our environment. We talked about how humans are highly adaptable and how that high adaptability is what has actually allowed us to survive for so long. So we adapt to our environment, and this model helps us understand, well, what exactly are we adapting to? This model, the one you see now, is highly based on generative somatics. But what I've done is I've added in that outer layer of evolution because we truly have been impacted by our evolution. And I'll explain a little bit more about that. In this model, they use the idea of shaping, they use the word shaping. And so generative somatics believes, and as do I also believe this, that we are literally shaped by our environment. So all of these rings that we're about to review have literally shaped us. It shaped how we hold our bodies. It shapes the sensations, feelings, emotions, thoughts we have inside our bodies. And it shapes our outer behavior. We are truly impacted by these elements. So these rings are sites of shaping, they shape us, and they are also sites of change. And this is exciting and important work to change ourselves, to change our world. These are all elements we can bring our attention to and begin to change these structures to bring about change in ourselves and change in our world. So, as a coach, I focus on the individual. I focus on how the individual has been shaped and what the individual can practice or choose to do in order to shift themselves. But there's very important work here in each of these rings to help shape and change our world. And so there's lots of people who focus at the level of social norms, for example, or institution. And they do work that brings about equality in the workplace. They do work to bring about pay equity. They do work to bring about equality in terms of female leadership in businesses and in government. And all of that is very important work. They do work in institutions or community groups like religions and churches to bring about female leaders there. All of that is very important work. So I focus on the individual as a coach, but there's a lot of heroes out there focusing on the rings, and both of these are important. So, starting with that outer circle or evolutionary shaping, we have been shaped by our evolution. And so, this is a lot of what we talked about in lessons 1 and 2. We have a need to focus on our survival. And because of that, there are some things that we do from an evolutionary point of view, we're not consciously choosing to do. But the way we have evolved as a human race shapes who we are today. So, this idea or this fact that we hardwire our early experiences, that the things we learn before age 8 and during puberty get hardwired in, and that we respond to that. So that's not something we've chosen to do. We haven't chosen to have those early experiences be hardwired into our brain, but they are, and they impact what we practice, how we show up today. They impact how we've been shaped. We have a need to belong. That is also hardwired in from an evolutionary point of view, right? Back on the Serengeti, we needed to belong to fight the tigers to find food. And so that is wired into our DNA. It's affected by our hormones. We are rewarded with oxytocin when we do things that help us belong to a group. So that is part of our evolution and it affects who we are today. We have resistance to change. So the fact that those early neural connections are bathed in myelin, that creates resistance to change. That's part of our evolution. That's just something that's there that affects us today. And we seek status. So I haven't touched on this too much yet, but it's something we are going to look at in day 28. This idea that we are rewarded by getting higher status in a group. And so we're constantly comparing ourselves to other people and evaluating how we fit in, how we rank compared to others. That has to do with our hormone serotonin. I'm going to speak a little bit more about that in day 28, but something to know for now, that is something that affects us, that affects how we show up today. Moving in one ring to spirit and landscape, a couple of elements here. We are affected by our geography. So if you live by water, you have a different mindset than if you live in the desert. If you live in a city, you have a different mindset than if you live in the suburbs. And so these things affect us, and it's something to reflect on. Where did you grow up, and how has your geography shaped you? Also, in this ring is spirituality. And I think our views on God, and I mean our collective views that are really held in North America, in Western Europe, but our views on God as being male, solely male. And how has that affected us? How has that affected our culture? How has that affected who gets to be in charge in our world today? Social norms, historical forces. So we're moving in one ring. What is socially acceptable over time? What has been in our history over time? And so certainly there's only been recent wins when it comes to the women's movement. Only 100 years ago, in 1920, for example, did women win the right to vote in the United States of America. Only recently are we seeing more women rise to leadership in business and government, and still the numbers there do not reflect where they should be. There's definitely still, I believe all of us can agree with this, a social pressure for women to look good, to be thin. So, how does that affect us? There's influence or there's pressure to be young, right? How does that affect older women? How does that affect all of us women as we age? There's a social culture or social norm for women to be perfect, to do it all, to have the perfect house, to have the perfect career, the perfect husband, the perfect kids, right? Certainly women have that pressure, men don't have that pressure. Social norms for women to not be outspoken is shifting a little bit, to not be outspoken, to not be too bold, right? All that messaging we received early on about being too bossy, all of that plays a role. It impacts us, it affects us. At an institutional level, so these are the structures that are in place today that continue to impact us. So, education, business, and government. And certainly there has been some progress there, but we still have pay inequality. Just in 2020, May 2020, Fortune released a list of their top 500 businesses, and 33 of the 500 businesses had female leaders at the helm. And that was a record. That was a record. So still, when you look around, it's a lot of males, a lot of white males, to bring that important element in as well. So the diversity is not quite there yet in terms of gender or in terms of race or in terms of sexual orientation either. Still some work to do in these areas, and I'm grateful for all of the heroes who work on things like this. From a political point of view, recent data, 24% of global leaders in politics were women, 24%, 8% heads of state were women. So still some progress to make there. Not yet equality reflected there. Community. So this is where we're going to start to get into your personal shaping. So how did the community you grow up in, how did the community you grew up in impact you? How did it shape you? How did your school impact you? How did the religious group you went to impact you? Any other community groups you were a part of? How did that impact you? And we're going to do an exercise on that coming up. Your family, your intimate network, your close friends growing up, your family, your extended family members, your neighbors, the people that played a role in your life, what messaging did they have to you? do they give you? So, for example, in my own family, my mom, and I'm grateful for her tremendous love, but she had some pretty clear messaging around how women should be. And essentially, I was told to find a wealthy man to marry. And so that, plays a role, especially if that kind of messaging is delivered from a very early age. And so how has the messaging you received from an early age, how has that impacted you? The order of your birth order in your sibling relationship, how did that impact you? Your siblings, how have they impacted you? All of this plays a role in how you've been shaped. And then individual. So sometimes we're born with different things that impact us, right? And so if you know anything about traits you were born with, you can put that in here. The research is really interesting. Basically, any trait that you have been born with. So, positive psychologists estimate that about 25 to 50% of any trait, so let's call it confidence or happiness or gratitude, about 25 to 50% of your gratitude level, for example, is determined by your genes, and about 50 to 75% is determined by what you do. So there is a baseline hereditary component, but also you can shift quite a bit by what you do. And certainly that's the focus of this program. So, just some stats here to consider are shaping this model. It really does impact how we think, be, and act. Still, recent data showing that our outer behavior is a reflection of how we have been shaped. So by age 4, both boys and girls associate expansive posture with males and contractive posture with females. That's research that comes from Amy Cuddy. So boys and girls, when they're shown gender neutral dolls in various positions, so gender neutral dolls, these are like Barbie and Ken, but no, no genitalia, but no breasts either, completely gender neutral. And when they see that gender neutral doll in an expanded shape, so taking up a lot of space, 4-year-old boys and girls say that is a male. And when they see a gender neutral doll in a contracted shape, so not taking up a lot of space, 4-year-old boys and girls say that is a female. And so that is a reflection of how we've been shaped. And this is what's being modeled. Although there's been improvements, this is still being modeled. When outnumbered in meetings, women speak up 75% less than men. That's research that comes out of Princeton. Again, this is not something we are consciously thinking about. This is a reflection of how we have been shaped over time in our families, in our culture, in our institutions. Women underestimate their abilities, and when we do, we're less likely to take risks. So, this is an interesting study done recently where they had a group of men and a group of women rank their scientific ability, rank how well they thought they would do on a science test. And women tended to rank their ability lower than men. They thought they would do worse. Both groups took the test. In actual effect, they both performed at a relatively similar level. So women under-ranked themselves, but performed at the same level as men. Where it gets complicated is when they were asked if they would like to take a harder test because the women had ranked themselves as lower because they did not believe in their ability. Overwhelmingly, the women said, I do not want to take the harder test, whereas the men were more likely to take the harder test. So the women rank themselves lower, they don't take risks. On the other hand, the men rank themselves higher and they do take the risks. And so this is, again, a reflection of how we've been shaped by our families, by our culture, by our history, all of that coming into play. And still recent data, this was 2019, women in general, there's been some improvement. In general, when women are asked what they think of women in general, they say women can be leaders. Men say that too, actually. Both of them say women can be leaders. But when women rank themselves, they say, but I'm not capable of leadership, right? So as a whole, women believe that women are equal to men, but they have a hard time holding those same views for themselves. So this is a wrap up of how we've been shaped by our environment. You're going to do a very concrete, practical exercise around this, and it provides cognitive understanding, which helps tie into our ability to be compassionate and self-caring towards ourselves.